Good evening. Welcome to this evening's edition of Tysky Sour. A slight change from usual. We've got a long-form interview with a fantastic guest this evening. I'll introduce them shortly. My name is Adam Bastani. You're watching Tysky Sour here on Novara Media. Before we get going, if you want to share the show, there's a link in the description below. There's a tweet, in fact. Give that a retweet. And if you want to get any comments in, put them on the hashtag Tysky Sour, and we'll take some more towards the end of the show. Put them in the comments with the rocket emoji. With no further ado, I want to introduce you to this evening's guest. His name is Adam Tooze. Adam's most recent book, first published in 2018, was Crashed. I think so far the outstanding history of the global financial crisis and its aftermath. It's got more than just that. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, good to be here.
He's also an academic. You can maybe go into some detail here at Columbia University. And Crashed strikes me as part of a broader project of 20th century, 21st century political economy, financial crises. Your other works, The Deluge, Wages of Destruction. For any of our audience who aren't necessarily familiar with your work, what's your background? Why are you writing about the things you're writing about? And we'll talk about how that's relevant to the coronavirus very shortly.
Well, I guess my background is I had a first degree in economics. I couldn't really hack economics as a discipline. We couldn't live with the culture fundamentally, either politically or just in personal terms, and was always fascinated by history, historical imagery. Apart from anything else, I think I just grew up looking at picture books like many kids, and ended up sliding sort of sideways out of economics into history, and have found, along with many other people, a kind of rather comfortable niche in the slot, which is sort of, it's not formal technical economic history in the sense that many people do it today, which is really quite technical economics with old data, with old numbers. It's more classical narrative history, really. I write quite classical, neoclassical history books, but with the core being a set of interests around different dimensions of power, military powers being the binding interest, but above all, also production and finance as key elements of what you mean, economic power. And that's really been an abiding interest across all of my books. The first one, which was about the history of economic statistics as a form of state knowledge. Then a book about Nazi Germany. I grew up in West Germany in the 70s and 80s. I grew up in the phase in which West Germany came to terms with its Nazi past. That shaped me very profoundly. So I wrote a book really which was sort of backing out of an economic and political economy of the Third Reich, the central significance of ideology for that regime, which makes it really very singular. Then backed up to write a sequel to that, which was Deluge, which is about the aftermath of World War I and the rise of America as the pivot of global power. And in a sense, Crashed is the other end of that arc, looking at the history of the financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath, and the relations essentially between the United States and Europe, with China as a sort of third element in that pattern. So that's really the unifying theme of all of those books, has been the question of economics, the economy, and how it figures in modern power and modern politics.
And very quickly, this is stuff that I find interesting, but again, maybe it's lost on some of the audience. What sort of historians do you look at as potential people to imitate in terms of style or in terms of the way that they wrote their books? Or subject matter?
It's actually kind of a tricky question. Who are the people that I like? I mean, I drew an enormous amount of inspiration from techie economic history, it has to be said. I mean, my generation of people came up with new global data sets in the late 1990s, these things called purchasing power parity adjusted GDP data, which are the sorts of things that we used, when we say that China is rising. Angus Maddison was the key figure in this. He sat at the OECD, which is one of the big think tanks of essentially the rich countries, and he compiled these amazing data sets that allowed us for the first time. I mean, he has this data set which goes back to the year zero, to the birth of Christ, and you can look at the development of the world economy. Whenever you see the FT or the Economist or anyone else doing one of these, return of China, rise of Asia, they're using that data. And so again and again in my work, what I've done is to take, as it were, a kind of kernel, a nugget from economics, if you like, and then try and tease out what its implications might be for a broader historical understanding of a particular moment. So I see myself really as sort of sitting on that segue. The people that drive this most tend to be the people who are doing that quite technical work. So for Crashed, it was a group of economists working on what we call macro finance, which is the intersection between macroeconomics and financial economics, which are two quite separate spheres, that have been forced together by the development of the modern financial system. And there was a group of them, the IMF now, not at the time, but also at the BIS, which is the club of central banks. People in the absolute mainstream of economics who seem to be saying things which I thought were really quite radical in their implications for our thinking about the global economy. So again and again, what I do is sort of seize on that kind of work and then try and figure out what its implications might be for politics, for the picture of, or shifting picture of global power.
I mean, I'll again, for people not familiar with the work, and this you might find this embarrassing, but yeah, I'm going to say it anyway. I think the sort of stuff you're doing for me, and this is going to sound embarrassing for you, but Fernand Braudel, Arrighi, people that just really scope out of a historical moment, I think obviously amazing. But I think what your gift is, obviously, I don't think you describe yourself as a journalist, but there's certainly a breezy journalistic style. You said narrative history. That certainly comes across in Crashed. And I think that's why I think it's a fantastic book. You've been doing a lot of writing recently about the coronavirus. I think in the last, 10 days, you've had pieces out with the LRB, with The Guardian. We're going to turn first to this piece from the LRB, a great piece, which was in the print edition. If we can just get graphic one up, Fox, on banking. Shockwave, Adam Tooze on the pandemic's consequences. Yeah, so this is it here. This was not a banking crisis like the one in 2008. This is in regard to the crisis, the financial dimension of this crisis with the coronavirus and effectively since March. This was not a banking crisis like the one in 2008, but had it not been for the spectacular intervention carried out by the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England and the ECB, we would now be facing not only the ravages of COVID-19 and the disastrous social and economic consequences of the lockdown, but a financial heart attack as well. Now, can you unpack that a bit? What was averted just a little more than a month ago by these major central banks? How did they stop the coronavirus crisis also becoming something far bigger and far worse?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's coming down the pike is terrible. We shouldn't lose sight of this, and I wouldn't, through an emphasis on the events in the financial markets of March, want to in any way deflect from the seriousness of what's coming. It's just that what is coming next could have been compounded by an absolute disaster in the financial system. Sorry, I'm haunted right now. I can't get past this number I read overnight about Michigan. 25% of the workforce of the state of Michigan signed on for unemployment benefit in a single month. 25%. I mean, it's just extraordinary what's happening. But we could have had a crisis even worse in the sense that, say, the funding for the major auto producers in the United States could have been shut off. So Ford was downgraded from investment grade to junk in the last couple of weeks. And that has very serious implications for their ability to fund and to continue paying payroll to the extent that they are, and maintaining relations with their suppliers. What we were seeing in the second and third week of March are fluctuations in financial markets of a severity that we have very rarely, if ever, witnessed. Huge volatility in share prices, huge movements in foreign exchange markets, which are gigantic. I mean, oceanic in scale. The foreign exchange market, which is centered on the city of London still, trades about $6.6 trillion a day on a regular day. And on the 18th of March, in particular, the Wednesday of the third week, the Wednesday when there was a real panic about the possibility of London being shut down by the British government, and basically that market became completely lopsided. For a market to function, you've got to have buyers and sellers, and all there were sellers of other currencies, and all anyone wanted was dollars. And so you saw absolutely huge fluctuations in currencies which don't normally move by 5% a day, like sterling, for instance. When that happens, it has a huge destabilizing effect on people's portfolios. We saw extraordinarily erratic movements in some of the most foundational markets of the financial system, which are sovereign debt markets. all the way back to the beginning of the modern financial system in the 17th century. The foundation of the financial system as a whole has been the market for government debt, because basically it's supposed to be super liquid. In other words, you can park money in government debt and always count on being able to sell it at a minimum discount, so you can get your money back whilst earning some interest in the meantime. When that stops being the case, it destabilizes the entire financial system. And in both the US Treasury market and the UK gilt market, in fact, even in the market for bunds, German debt, public debt, we saw really erratic movements with prices going up and down, the big gaps between different bonds of different maturities that ought normally to be completely smooth, with people trading back and forth between them, huge gaps opening up, which was telling you that basically people were being forced to sell who didn't want to be selling. And this is extremely alarming from the point of view of the broader stability of the system. We saw huge spikes in credit default swaps for various types of high-risk corporate debt, which signals the possibility of funding crunches. So all of this was profoundly worrying for the central banks, who could see a credit crunch basically coming down the pike. Various types of financially engineered entities, much like those which blew up in 2008, things like CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, which are packages of different types of corporate debt, were behaving incredibly erratically. And to neutralize this, basically, the central banks of the world stepped in and made markets for all of this stuff. Basically, they announced in various forms that they would buy it, or they would provide funding for other people who would buy it, so as to prevent these price fluctuations in these different types of credit product.
So I'll ask you, I'll ask probably quite a few sort of more simple elementary questions, just so, because obviously for a lot of people it just makes very little sense.
Yeah.
Why was everybody flooding out from other currencies and going into dollars? And for instance, where there's risk everywhere, people always go, for instance, to gold, to commodities like gold. Very safe, low returns, but very safe. Yeah. Why were people going from even gold into dollar in March?
Because in the end, the dollar is the most fungible asset. It's the asset that you can exchange for other things. You can always buy things with dollars. And you can always settle debts with dollars. And in a moment of absolute panic, that's what you run into. I mean, gold was even selling off in the worst moments. So there was really no way of stabilizing a portfolio. The way that people manage risk, if they've got to manage lots of money, is that they balance different types of risk against each other. So you have a bit of commodities, you have a bit of government debt, you have some shares, you might have some gold, you have a mix of different currencies. And what we saw in those two critical weeks, second and third week of March, was just everything selling. There were days where literally everything was going. And so that then triggers a further reaction, which is that everyone's algorithms, on which so much investment now rides, start basically playing up, because they're supposed to operate on the basis of correlations in which if one thing goes down, something else goes up. And if everything is selling off, basically they start triggering safety catches, which say, sell everything. Don't try and balance, just sell everything, go into cash. And the cash spiral ultimately ends up in dollars. So that's the kind of instability that was unleashed. And the problem with that, of course, is that in the end, there's only one provider of dollars in the world, and that's the American central bank. They're the only people with the unlimited dollar money tree. And so huge pressure ends up piling onto the American central bank and all the intermediary chains. All the way from from Thailand all the way to New York.
You've mentioned CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, a lot of these sort of strange instruments that people only first heard of after 2008. I'm not going to comment on whether or not they're good things, but clearly they malfunctioned in a serious way 12 years ago. Has the situation with those kinds of instruments or vehicles, or whatever they are, often viewed as quite safe for 2008, less safe after 2008? Have there been any sort of systemic or structural changes to make them a little bit more subject to political oversight and control in the meantime? Do central banks know what they're doing a bit more with CLOs and how to stop a crisis situation a bit better than 12 years ago?
I mean, one doesn't want to go out, after a crisis like this, everyone's afraid of saying, oh, well, this time it's going to be much better. Is you don't want to be the idiot who pronounced the system safe just before it blew up in a way that no one had foreseen. It is impressive to see how quickly this time around the central banks have responded to this crisis. I mean, they're using many of the same techniques as they did in 2008, but in hindsight, history gets telescoped. The mortgage crisis began in the spring of 2007, and it got, the wheels really came off in September after the failure to bail out Lehman, and the crisis was still rumbling on really into January 2009, when two of the big American commercial banks, Bank of America and Citigroup, were looking very fragile. So that's a long time span compared to Corona, which has given us, what was weeks and months then is days now. And the central banks have responded, in a sense, by just rolling out many of the instruments that they used previously. They've done it more quickly, and they've done it on an absolutely gigantic scale. Truly, truly mind-boggling scale. Have they understood the derivative products better? Yes, I think broadly speaking, they do understand those risks better. There has been a relentless search, really, since 2008 for the new risk that could kick you in the butt this time around. Does that mean that we actually have regulatory oversight of all of the fund management system, which is really the new frontier of financial risk? The answer is emphatically no, and that's been a running really argument in financial regulatory circles over the recent years is, do we have full control of the risk there? The answer is clearly not, especially when they pile into narrow markets in emerging market debt, where there's really not that much debt being traded, and you have very big players like BlackRock, for instance, in those kind of markets. The risk of them all trying to pile out quickly and therefore being forced to sell at increasingly discounted prices is really quite high. And we can see the banks, JP Morgan really leading the charge here, making the case that the instability we saw in March this year is the result, the perverse side effect, they argue, of the regulations that were put in place in 08, 09. The weasel word they use is liquidity, because the regulations made it more expensive for them to warehouse risk, to take other people's risk and put it on their balance sheet. Mm-hmm. And because they're profit maximizing entities, they won't do that anymore. And that means that, say in the second week of March, or 9th of March, for instance, when everyone wanted to sell, there is no one on the other side, because JP Morgan isn't going to take the risk of absorbing everyone else's sales. What that means is the central bank has to step in more quickly, because there aren't the private actors in between. I think, frankly, from a systemic stability point of view, I'm quite happy that there aren't risk-happy, profit-happy, large private entities in between here. It's in some senses a more stable system for this simply to end up on the balance sheet of the central bank for the duration of whatever crisis. And it has to be said, of course, that this crisis is like no other we've ever experienced. There wasn't a whole hell of a lot of point in designing a regulatory system so as to be ready for a COVID-19 shutdown. That sure. wasn't something that was built deep into everyone's understanding of what the risks were. We were spending quite a lot of time, for instance, thinking about stranded assets and climate risk. That had gone way up the regulatory agenda, and regulatory pressure was being used to shift financial actors in a direction that was more compatible with at least the Paris objectives, for instance. But no one had seriously thought about, stress testing the balance sheets of major financial actors for a pandemic shutdown, because we've never done this before. No one has ever seriously contemplated stopping the economic machine so as to minimize the pressure on the health system faced with this kind of challenge.
Yeah, it's obviously all the economic data, well, particularly today, it's got really, not impressive, but, jaw-dropping. It's the stuff that we've heard about in recent weeks just kind of being confirmed. And, people go, Martin Wolf from the FT today, the economy has collapsed. Like, well, yeah, this is, for all the metaphors of total mobilization, war economy, this is a total demobilization of the economy. Yeah. Fox, if we can just go to graphic 3, apologies. This is in the same article that you wrote in the LRB, Adam. Any fantasy of convergence that we might have entertained after the fall of communism, i.e. Late 80s, early 1990s, has surely by now been dispelled. We will somehow have to patch together China's one-party authoritarianism, Europe's national welfarism, and whatever it is the United States will be in the wake of this disaster. But in any case, for those of us in Europe and America, these questions are premature. The worst is just beginning. I suppose the final part there we'll talk about shortly. But this idea of the fantasy of convergence coming to an end, I guess this dovetails with conversations people are increasingly having about deglobalization. How should we understand this idea of deglobalization? Obviously, it's kind of been happening in part since 2008. Whether you're talking about geopolitics, the return of Russia, obviously the continued rise of China, et cetera, et cetera. But if we're looking at sort of stage posts in history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, do you think this is a stage post in history in terms of that deglobalizing effect, or is it just another stage? 2008 was one, this is another. How could we begin to understand the coronavirus as a not a terminus, as a sort of a point on the path towards this deglobalizing process?
I mean, I don't think I used the term deglobalization.
You didn't. But
it wouldn't have been my intention. I'm not sure I find that helpful to think in those terms. I do think it's the end of a story of convergence. I mean, after all, and this I think has been evident for many years now, is that we in a sense rely on the authoritarianism and the divergence of China to keep the wheels on the bus. I mean, it's a very, very perverse relationship, from a liberal point of view, from the point of view of a kind of liberal modernization convergence model, where we assume, as it were, that stability comes from everyone becoming more and more alike. What we're actually seeing is that prosperity in the global economy is maintained by a growth engine in China, which is managed by the legitimate heirs of the Maoist revolution of the 1930s and 1940s, who have in no way abandoned their commitment. Of course, to power, the ideology of the party has shifted in fundamental ways, and it's now, in some senses, a nationalist project, first and foremost, of national state building, but profoundly authoritarian. And we rely on its remarkable managerial and technocratic capacities to keep the engine of global capital accumulation and growth going. Whereas in the 1990s, we imagined, if you like, that China would converge with the West. What we now hope is that they don't, because if they had, they would not have the capacity to manage the instability of their own growth and that of the wider world. And this became absolutely manifest after 2008, when in Europe and the United States suffered a cataclysmic crisis in their financial systems, and China really dragged the cart of the world economy out of the mud with an epic stimulus program of both government spending and parastate banks. They have all these policy banks, which are effectively, well, a lot of the time they operate as almost oligarchic kind of adjuncts to the Chinese economy. But when push comes to shove, if the party said, let's go, let's do some investment spending, they act, and they act very quickly on a really large scale. And we saw this again in 2015, 2016, when the Chinese suffered a very serious shock to their growth pattern, collapse in the Shanghai Stock Exchange, a flight of about $1 trillion of Chinese capital out of the Chinese currency. And there was this remarkable editorial. I think this idea really struck home to me. It was like an Economist editorial, like one of their end-of-year roundups, January 2016. And it was this wholehearted, full-throated celebration of the effectiveness of Beijing in restoring exchange controls, regulating their banks, reimposing restraint and isolation, if you like, on the Chinese economy relative to the world economy. It was due to that the wheels were put back on the bus and growth continued in 2016. So we've been living in that world for a long time, and Corona is just a further demonstration, in a sense, of that reality, which is that their control of the virus was dramatically more effective than ours. I mean, they ended up with an epidemic out of control in one province, the size of Italy. We've ended up with 5-6 hotspots, and in the US, and we yet to see how far it will go. But New York alone is a Hubei, Wuhan style outbreak. New York State, New York City. So and China is the bit of the world economy that's restarting. So there's that asynchronous. I mean, I'm a funny kind of liberal, because I'm also one of the most key axioms, I think, of analysis of the world has got to be Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development, because that is precisely the sort of condition that really defines the world economy at this moment. It's combined, interacting, interdependent, but spectacularly uneven in the different elements that are linked together. And anyone who believed in a sort of happy liberal story of everyone converging towards a similar political, legal, economic model has been profoundly disillusioned since the 90s.
we're going to go to the Guardian article shortly, but I just wanted to ask, I suppose, because obviously you've done a book before on the crisis following the First World War and the Britain, abandoning the gold standard, etc., that period.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't think that the period we're now in is analogous to the period immediately following sort of First World War / thereafter the sort of Great Depression, that deglobalizing period we saw in the 30s, geopolitical sort of.
I don't even think of the interwar period as deglobalizing. I mean, I really think, for me, globalization is a condition. It's a condition which has existed in its modern form, broadly speaking, since the middle of the 19th century. And then there are struggles within that to articulate and structure the way in which we globally interact. And some of those have about them a sort of simplistic meshing together: free trade, free movement of people, free movement of ideas. Some of them are antagonistic, but they're nonetheless globalized for that. The Cold War, after all, was a vehicle of globalization, but it was a profoundly divided globalization. I think the moment that we're in is a sort of multipolar, more or less antagonistic version, but that overlays and interacts with areas in which we're radically interconnected. It's very difficult, I think, for us to get back behind and sort of exit the condition of existing because in a global way, because that would really mean a return to an early modern condition. Or early modern historians will tell you, even then, as it were, that the great imperial tectonic plates, if you like, of human civilization were actually interconnected. As a modernist, I'd say shine, there was the Silk Road, but it was nowhere near as intense as what you see from the middle of the 19th century onwards. In any case, to reverse globalization in that fundamental sense, it will take far more than a trade war or even a geopolitical standoff, because those are actually ways of relating to each other. They're just antagonistic, but they operate at the level of the globe. And this has been the condition, ever since the classic period of imperialism, the pre-1914 period of the first globalization, which in some senses is modified and becomes differently shaped in the interwar period, was after all also the period of high imperialism. This is the classic period which Hobson and Lenin interpret. And so I think of imperialism and globalism as different ways of describing similar moments. They are systems formed within a single closed planetary view of interconnection and interrelation. And we shouldn't surrender the term globalization to the simplistic vision simply of integration and of harmonious, commercially mediated, uniformity. That flat world vision is a very particular. It's never accurate, and it's conditioned by very particular moments.
I'm a bit of a technological determinist, so I don't view globalization of trade or commodity chains as globalization. Yeah, I'm more of a time-space compression person, but that's the kind of easy binary we sort of tend to get. And we noticed this Guardian piece, Fox. If we can get up image, graphic 6, survive. Sorry, Fox. This is the Guardian piece, long read, recommended. It's out today. I think about 4,500 words. It's a long read, but it is very good. How coronavirus almost brought down the global financial system. And this is from that piece. To survive the lockdown, millions of families and firms around the world are relying on grants and loans from the state. But tax revenues have collapsed, so states need credit too. Across the world, we're witnessing the largest surge in deficits and government debt since the Second World War. Now, today, we also had the news that I think Britain's deficit could rise to 14%, which is, we've not really seen anything like that. I think it's more than actually what the coalition inherited in 2010. I think it was like it was about 10%. Yeah. And then we're going to see debt.
That was epic.
Yeah. And we're going to see debt to GDP potentially around 100% in 12 months' time. Could be worse, of course, and maybe slightly better. I suppose the argument
I wouldn't talk of it in those terms. It could be higher or lower, I would say, not worse or better.
So this is but for people that are coming from the mental landscape of, that's a very good point, of austerity, the idea that you should be running fiscal surpluses or high deficits are bad. Obviously, we don't need to get into that too much. For a lot of people who've been sort of encumbered with that debate, they'll be thinking, oh, wow, debt to GDP 100%, deficit 14%. So that's really, really bad. So, to what extent can all of Europe, for instance, and the United States and Japan run fiscal deficits, and for how long? Is that a plausible thing? There are some people that think it is, but what's your view on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's essential at this moment as well that they do. And anything else would be disastrous. We're seeing an absolutely catastrophic collapse in private demand, and we're very likely to see a shocked reaction in which private investment and households who've suffered this epic shock retreat into higher levels of saving and lower levels of consumption. And furthermore, we're going to see a classic downward spiral in which hundreds of millions, not millions or tens, but hundreds of millions of people have essentially been made unemployed in various different ways. It's novel forms of unemployment as well. So their consumption is going to be down. And against that backdrop, it's absolutely essential that governments make up the slack and provide demand for the economy. I mean, you could make the case for degrowth, and people, before the shock were making the argument for degrowth on grounds of climate sustainability, and that's an argument that should be seriously entertained. But no one planned for it this way. And the risk, of course, is that it will be profoundly inequitable. And folks like myself, and imagine you as well, who've got the resources of relative comfort and a nice place to live and can get through this crisis, will, broadly speaking, be okay. But there are hundreds of millions of people who are absolutely not in that condition. For them, it's essential that various types of bridging finance, or just frankly grants, are provided in this situation. And so, yes, that will increase government debt, but government debt's a problem for the aftermath. And it's, to my mind, really an open question whether it's a problem at all. It's a problem if you allow debt markets to exercise a veto over you. But all the major sovereign states, not all countries in the world, but all of the advanced economy states have enough autonomy to maneuver their way through this without becoming the hostages of aggressive bond markets. Not true for emerging markets and developing states, because the monetary system of the world is intensely hierarchical. But the advanced economies have the capacity to manage this, and they also have the capacity to soften the trade-offs for the emerging markets and the poorer, the truly poor, the low-income countries around the world, if they choose to do so. And that's being debated in Washington as we speak, literally right now, in these minutes and hours. That's a huge topic at the G20, G7, World Bank, IMF meetings, which are happening virtually right now.
So you're of a position, as I think any reasonable or rational person is, with the exception perhaps of Arthur Laffer or Ian Duncan Smith. Generally speaking, we want full demobilization of the economy. We're going to have to run deficits because of a downturn in demand.
Yeah,
it's going to mean higher public debt, but we're also going to see private household debt, because of course people are taking out loans to just tie themselves over. We may see higher rates of corporate debt,
which is why it's so important to keep the financial system going, right? Because it's not for its own sake. This isn't a crisis like 2008 where the banks were going to pull down. We need the credit system to operate, whether it's you continuing to pay, I don't know, your cleaner, even if they can't work for you because they need to continue their livelihood. So you extending that private support, whether it's you borrowing on your credit card or whatever else, we all need to tide our way through this crisis through various types of credit, which is why maintaining that credit system is so crucial, particularly at this moment.
But how does this look? Say we have a vaccine in 12 months. Say that generally speaking, the long-term trends are no different to what they were, which weren't great before December. Macroeconomic trends globally, global south, the US, Europe, and so on. What would a solution look like? Would you have to see a move to inflation to sort of get rid of some of these debts? Well, would you have to have debt forgiveness, haircuts? Because even the idea of austerity, the idea of we would have further cuts, that there would be so much debt held by so many different entities at so many different levels. It doesn't seem a plausible solution.
Yeah, I mean, by far and away, the most attractive scenario would be the 1950s, 1960s scenario, which is responsible finance. I mean, the 50s and 60s, we think of them as the Keynesian period. In fact, they were running surpluses of various types. I wouldn't advocate a surplus now, but by all means, obviously, run down the crisis level spending. But then on the other hand, rapid growth in nominal GDP, which is the combination of inflation and actual economic growth. And that erodes the debt to GDP ratio, and inflation bites away. It's essentially a tax on everyone holding a monetary claim on anyone else. And that's, only fair under the circumstances. It's equally distributed. It's silent and deadly, nevertheless. So it's a very effective way of dealing with a monetary debt overhang like this. The problem, and it's a huge problem, and it was a huge problem at the beginning of this year before the crisis hit and had preoccupied monetary policy makers for years now, is they can't get inflation to go. And now that begs questions then, and the most obvious reason as to why it's difficult to make inflation go is there's no bargaining power in the economy right now. And one of the reasons you have to remind people is that they did, in fact, quite deliberately crush the bargaining power of one of the most powerful groups, which was organized labor in the 70s and 80s. So they shouldn't be surprised now that wages don't respond in the way that they used to, right? So there's a real kind of forgetfulness on the part of people engaged in conventional policy making, like, whoops, hang on, why is this dog dead? Why, if we give it more leash, does it not run? Well, you fundamentally change the balance of power, and also by globalization, of course, increase the global labor supply spectacularly, so reduce people's bargaining power. In any case, we were dealing with the problem of what folks had started calling lowflation. So it would be wonderful if we could get to 4 or 5% inflation in the aftermath of this. That would be by far and away the easiest way of dealing with it. It's just unlikely that we will be able to engender that, because the environment's quite likely to be deflationary because of the suppression of consumption and the shock to confidence. So to my mind, by far and away the easiest thing to do is to park this debt on the balance sheet of the central bank, as much of it as you can, and park it there. It begs the question of what it's doing there and how you unwind it from there, but it postpones the question. And above all, what it means is the political system is not flooded with the toxic question of public finance, which did so much damage to the recovery after 2008. Paul Krugman has this great line, it all went wrong in 2010. Yeah. By which he means basically that the political system became overwhelmed by an argument that it's just proven in most democratic systems incapable of resolving in an intelligent way. The vast majority of economists will adopt the kind of functional finance view, which says the debt's largely neutral to indifferent with regard to the performance of the economy, as long as you can place it somewhere safe. Very few people would actually turn it into, like, the be-all and end-all of economic policy, but conservative politicians across the world did that, in the US, in Europe, in Britain, of course, with disastrous consequences, above all for public investment, but also for basic public services and for the welfare of the most vulnerable in society. So that is what we want to avoid, because there is a distinct risk of the debts which were run up in this crisis being used essentially as a weapon against progressive policy of any kind for years to come.
Again, for somebody watching that's not necessarily familiar with all the arguments, just a quick answer, because we can go into the important questions of the global south and also the Eurozone. All this money, all this liquidity is being created by central banks, has been for 12 years. You've had quantitative easing, you've had something new happen actually in the last couple of weeks in the UK, for instance. So why hasn't that led to higher rates of inflation? Because, of course, if you've got the exact same amount of economic activity happening, but you've got more money for the same amount of things, I mean, the average Joe thinks, well, surely inflation goes up. Why hasn't that happened?
It should be even worse. We've got far less economic activity. Yeah. What that demonstrates is that relationship between money and inflation is highly variable. And it depends on whether the money gets out, if you like, to put it crudely, into the economy, whether people are actually able to spend it and generate credit. And of course, they're not able to, because the economy is being paralyzed by our commitment to the lockdown. So what instead happens is the money builds up in bank accounts and balance sheets of various types, and managing the exit will be about making sure that doesn't flood out. But as I said, if they could actually engender inflation of 4 or 5%, or frankly, if you could have a burst of slightly more than that, it would by no means be the worst of all worlds. So what we've seen since 2007-8, where we had a dress rehearsal for what's happening now, is that relationship between the quantity of money, which shows up in the balance sheets of the central bank and private banks, and price inflation has just basically collapsed.
We have got about another 15 minutes to go. We're going to go to questions shortly. We've got 1,650 people watching, I think, which is fantastic for quite a arcane debate around political economy. We've only got 636 likes, however. We want to get those likes up. 1,650 is a big discrepancy here. 1,660 watching, only 645 likes. Smash the like button. Of course, we want you to subscribe. We want you to go to support novaramedia.com. We've got it, novaramedia.com/support, sorry. We want you to do that too. But this is frictionless. This costs you nothing. Very neoliberal in a sense. So smash the like button. Really appreciate it. Let's get up to 1,500 before the end of the show. And like I said, put your questions in the comments section with the rocket emoji or on the hashtag. Adam, we've talked about it briefly. Why is this crisis so much more problematic for the global south, for poorer countries, than it is for countries like, or economic areas like the European Union, Great Britain, China and the US?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, they're subject to a much greater degree of financial panic. When money runs into the center, as we were talking about earlier on, when people are chasing into dollars, then it's the weaker currencies on the edges of the highly hierarchical global monetary system that are most severely affected, and that's really what we've seen. We've seen the largest withdrawal of funding. One shouldn't say necessarily foreign, because some of this will be domestic business interests also taking their money out of the so-called emerging markets in the last 4 months that we've seen really in recent decades. It's worse than the crises of the late 1990s. It's worse than 2013, 15, 16. So the emerging market economies, which are sort of generally celebrated as the frontier of capitalist growth, are suffering a huge contraction in this run to safety. They're seeing huge shocks to commodity prices, which are what makes investment in, say, sub-Saharan African countries attractive in many places. And they have the full force of the epidemic coming their way. And though people glibly say, oh, well, these are young countries with, youthful populations. I mean, that's true on the one hand, but it's also true that India has the second largest number of people over the age of 60 in the world, not surprisingly, because it's enormous. There's 120 million vulnerable Indians by that simple metric, which will overwhelm even the most sophisticated medical system. And India was having financial problems before the crisis hit. So it's that combination of the health crisis, which is on its way, and the financial squeeze, which is applied most severely to those what the investors like to call frontier markets of the global system, that's really producing that squeeze. In addition, many of them borrow in dollars. They repay then out of business, which is generated in local currency. And so as the dollar rises against other currencies globally, that makes the burden of that debt much more severe. And so as people rush into the dollar, it drives the value of the dollar up. People run into safety. But everyone who's borrowed in dollars then suddenly finds the burden of those repayments much more difficult to meet, and that's a real pressure for many low-income and developing economies.
And this shift that you note in the book in Crash, and it's kind of been there for a while, but it solidifies really with after 2008 the policy response to it, and you're seeing it really now, as you make very clear in the Guardian piece and the LRB piece. There's a privileging here, as there obviously always has been, of the global north over the global south. As this intensifies, as this crisis intensifies, is there a very? I mean, I think the FT said that Saudi Arabia will be the worst affected country of anybody in the world in terms of the impact of this, the overhead, the economic overhead. Is there a very real possibility of certain regions, certain countries almost de-developing? And I'll be clear what I mean by that. You look at a region, for instance, like West Asia, collapse in oil prices, already had geopolitical instability, already had relatively weak healthcare infrastructures. You add to that, obviously, a huge downturn in the economy. It seems quite analogous to the economic, well, obviously much worse, in fact, to the economic conditions which precede the Arab Spring in sort of 2010, 2011. Do you think that what we're seeing now, it's not nice to speculate about it in crystal ball gaze, but what kinds of crises could we be seeing stored up right now in the medium to longer term, and what regions do you think will be worse affected by that?
Well, I mean, as you say, it's a kind of lugubrious and slightly morbid exercise to do this sort of mental stress testing of places. But let's take two countries either end of the African continent. So South Africa, which is really in the crosshairs right now. It was downgraded to junk 2 weeks ago. Its sovereign debt was. It has 6 million, I think actually 7 million people living with HIV/AIDS who are extraordinarily vulnerable to the disease. It has a unemployment problem second to none in the world, one of the most dysfunctional labour markets in the world. Its economic growth has not been keeping pace with population growth for years, and it's now going to actually look at a recession. And the currency, the rand, has collapsed against the dollar, and it has a totally dysfunctional electricity utility, which is key to sustaining industrial growth in a place like South Africa. So that is a kind of classic combination of developmental problems that could really derail what is, after all, still, just warts and all, nevertheless, one of the essential success stories of the post-Cold War era, the overcoming of apartheid and the formation of something like a multiracial democracy in South Africa. At the other end of the continent, Algeria, I would single out rather than Saudi Arabia. I mean, which, after all, Saudi has huge problems domestically, politically, of course, but huge financial reserves. Algeria is a completely different kettle of fish. High-cost oil producer, so hammered by the oil price collapse. Young, dynamic population. Social crisis. It did not experience the Arab Spring in 2011 in the way that, say, in neighboring Tunisia did. 85% of its export revenue is dependent on oil and gas. And the last time Algeria was hit by a huge collapse in fossil fuel prices in the late 80s, it destabilized the social structure there to the point which unleashed the ghastly civil war in the 90s between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military regime, which basically took power there by coup in the early 90s. So I think there has to be real concern about the stability of several of and that's just two that particularly seem particularly vulnerable to this shock. But this is the most severe shock that the emerging markets in the developing world have probably suffered, certainly in simultaneous, because countries like Argentina have suffered repeated shocks. But for all of the world economy to simultaneously suffer this shock is really unprecedented. The IMF today announced that they expect the world economy to shrink by 3%. That's the first time since World War II that the world economy as a whole has shrunk. And so we don't actually know what this system looks like when it's subject to that kind of pressure, because that affects everyone. Every single manufacturer, every commodity exporter will be under massive pressure.
We're going to go to questions shortly. Get those on the hashtag. I want to ask you one more question, which really relates to the European dimension of this. This is from that same Guardian long read. To ensure that investors stay calm, it is the job of central banks to act as the buyer of last resort. But because Italy is a member of the Eurozone, it no longer has an independent national central bank that can buy its debt. Its monetary policy is set by the European Central Bank, the ECB, which is prohibited from directly buying a member country's newly issued debt. You go on to say that left the Italians exposed as the coronavirus crisis intensified in late February and investors became concerned by the prospect of greater state spending. The spread to German interest rates increased. If they rose too far, Germany would face not only a public health disaster, but a financial crisis too.
Italy would, yeah.
Sorry, Italy, my apologies.
Yeah.
Italy would face not only a public health disaster, but a financial crisis too. What could Europe do to help? Now, are you insinuating here that there's a relationship between what you call the financial corset or the fiscal corset imposed on Italy by its membership of the European Central Bank and the fact that, relatively speaking, and this is quite clear in terms of percentage of GDP, its fiscal response is very weak compared to Germany and France, but also more concerningly, has this impacted its public health response?
Not insinuating, shouting it as loudly as and of course, I'm by no means alone. This is the hot issue in European politics right now, and I think it has the potential to permanently damage the Eurozone. Northern politicians in the Eurozone and their electorates severely underestimate the damage that was done by the 2010 Eurozone crisis, which to my mind has taken on aspects of a kind of civil war memory. In other words, there's a struggle between North and South, and the South, even pro-European, pro-EU, Europhile politicians in the South understand the profound resentments in Spain and Italy over the way in which the Eurozone policy was pursued. So yes, no, absolutely, that's the whole show in the Eurozone right now. I think, thank God that both the Spanish and the Italian governments have just gone ahead and spent what they needed to spend on the health response. That I don't think is really the primary issue. Those were supply capacities. Could you get the ventilators? Could you get the protective equipment that you needed? You could make the case, of course, that in both Spain and Italy, the healthcare system was starved over the longer term by the austerity, and that's a very valid argument. But But in this immediate crisis, the issue really is not so much the immediate health response, but the offsetting stimulus is not the right word, the degree of life support that the European governments can provide to their economies during the lockdown. And then moving on from there, the degree of stimulus, because that's then the right term, that they'll be able to apply to their economies when we finally come out of the lockdown. And already now, there is an embarrassing divergence between the sudden generosity of Berlin, which has overthrown the infamous debt brake and is suddenly willing to have deficits and is providing enormous credit guarantees to German business of all shapes and sizes, and the ability of Rome and Madrid, or not just the ability, but the willingness, in light of the risks, of those capitals to provide support to their national economies. And that cannot, it will objectively, it's very likely to objectively increase the already large disparities between their economies. And it will also, of course, foster resentment, and quite reasonably, on the part of the Italians and the Spanish. This is in no way to, as it were, to provide succor or encouragement for nationalists who want to take advantage of this. But the opportunity is there, and it's being provided to people like Salvini by this kind of policy. And the unwillingness and the failure of the other European nation states to agree to a program which will neutralize those differences in light of this crisis.
This is a political question, I suppose. We're going to go to questions, right? I mean, I'll keep it very brief. I pose it to Yanis Varoufakis, and it makes more sense because, obviously, as well as being an academic, he is an elected politician. Yeah. But if you look at the sort of growth trajectory of, you've already talked about the 50s and the 60s, of somewhere like Germany, it had a kind of soft peg to the dollar as it was becoming wealthier, undervalued its currency, export orientation. Why shouldn't a country like Italy, still has a very large industrial sector, why shouldn't it get rid of the euro, readopt the lira, slightly devalue, could peg it to the euro in some sense, and run deficits, try and, like you were talking about before, relatively high inflation, high nominal GDP growth, wind down its national debt. These are all the things that were normal kind of 40, 50 years ago. What's the argument against doing that? I can't see why the argument would be so compelling to not do that. I can see it for Greece, only 1% of European GDP, etc. But for a country like Italy, still a top 10 global economy, why shouldn't they do that?
Well, I mean, this is not it's worth asking, first of all, why did they decide to do it in the first place? And it wasn't it was a reformist elite. There was a pro-European, reformist, let's call it, like, for sake of argument, Blairite elite in Italy, the likes of Mario Monti, but also Mario Draghi, who were committed to reforming Italy by way of attachment to the project of the euro. And the gamble was that the discipline of the euro would be good for the Italian economy, and Italy's voice within the Eurozone would allow it to moderate that discipline such that it was not destructive of the Italian economy. So it was a two-sided gamble. It was a gamble taken under extreme circumstances. In the early 1990s, when the Italian economy was in bad shape, its finances appeared to be in free fall, and the Italian political system had exploded in the aftermath of the Cold War, which is what opened the door to people like Berlusconi. So that was their gamble, and the gamble has sort of paid off, but only partially. So they have changed the ECB. The ECB is no longer the heir to the Bundesbank that it once was, which drives the German conservatives crazy, and the German conservatives then dig in their heels on the other issues which Italy needs flexibility on, and that's, if you like, the impasse that we're at. The French, the Italians, the Spanish won one part of the gamble and then have not been able to prevail in actually moving towards a sensible fiscal policy as well. And precisely because the German conservatives know they lost the monetary game, they're ever more determined to dig in their heels on the fiscal side. Well, you then might say, oh, well, wouldn't it be better for Italy to be out? The answer is that one could imagine, hypothetically, 10 years from now, an Italian economy with its own currency, maybe a bit like Britain, for instance, bobbing along, using devaluation to restore its position when it needed to. The problem is the transition costs. And it's all very well to say that, the Eurozone is bad for Italy, but that doesn't follow that exiting the Euro is a viable alternative in any way. And that's one area where I would disagree with Yanis on Greece as well. It's as bad as the Euro obviously is for Greece, it's not obvious in 15 or now that exiting would be a better option for Greece. And the risks are very considerable, both politically and economic, were you to tumble out and to take the risks of a really catastrophic exit. Because the problem is that all of the debts are denominated in euro, all of the claims are denominated in euro, and we simply don't have a historical example of a successful breaking apart of a currency system and in an economy as sophisticated as that of Italy. So it would be a truly catastrophic path in the medium term, not just the short run, but in the medium term for a country like Italy. And that implies a degree of tragedy, if you like, in the sense that choices were made by a particular group of people. They gambled on a particular strategy. It's only very partially worked out. The consequences now are obviously very serious. And that is why the argument within the Eurozone, I think, needs to be as serious and frankly as earnest and in some sense almost as desperate as it needs to be at this point, because the carrying on the way we are, the way the Eurozone is a profoundly unattractive option.
That's a great answer. We've got two questions here. The first is from Nathan Massey. If QE money, quantitative easing money, is sitting in the accounts of the wealthy rather than getting into the hands of people who would spend it, leading to inflation or at least stopping deflation, is one solution to go hard on negative interest rates?
You could indeed. I mean, what we need to do is find some way of taxing those balances, and that's a very reasonable strategy. Inflation would be effectively a negative interest rate. So I agree that the zero bound, this is the technical term for the zero interest rate. There's a sense in which you can't go, but that's nonsense. It's just very unconventional. But the ECB is exploring all sorts of different options there, where you split the interest rate system up so that you reward people for certain sorts of lending, penalize them for holding certain sorts of cash balance. That's certainly an option. It's a highly technical option. We've never done something on quite that scale before. It's historically, people talk about this kind of strategy as one of financial repression. It works much better. We know it works historically against the backdrop of a moderate inflation rate, where you effectively impose negative interest rates on people by offering them controlled bank rates, which are lower than the inflation rate, which makes a negative overall rate. The thought is exactly right. The question is really whether under the current circumstances, a technical device like that would work.
We've got a question from Antti Peltola. I think it looks like it's finished. €10 super chat. Thank you, Antti. I would like to know Adam Tooze's take on Bank of England financing UK Treasury directly. Yeah. This kind of seems talking about basically, what was it, the direct monetary finance stuff that was being talked about a few days ago. You can maybe talk about that.
Yeah.
So to repeat that question, it's on the screen. I would like to know Adam Tooze's take on the Bank of England financing the UK Treasury directly.
Right. Yeah.
Can you explain that slightly? Explain the question slightly to the audience, and then your response.
I'll try to. I mean, it has to be said that like a large part of the global wonk community has spent the last, it was Thursday last week that it was announced, trying to figure out exactly what it adds up to. But basically, the idea is that the standard way of financing a government is to tax, obviously, or you can finance a government by borrowing. And when you do that, you issue government bonds, and private investors of various types, pension funds or rich individuals or whatever, give the government cash in exchange for an IOU. Now, direct financing, in the simplest form, is simply the third way of financing a government, which is so-called printing money. Now, and that, of course, immediately evokes nightmarish scenarios of the Weimar Republic, or Zimbabwe is the term that's always invoked in the modern era because of the hyperinflation that was suffered in the final phases of Mugabe's regime there. And what the Bank of England announced last week was something which is a sort of strange halfway house. It actually has a fairly long tradition in the relations between the Treasury and the Bank of England, which are much closer than they are for most banks. We know the Bank of England was made independent by the Blair government in '97, but those relationships are really always institutional. They're as much, as it were, the effect of legal language as anything else. And it is the case that the British government continues to have a current account with the Bank of England, effectively, the Ways and Means account. And depending on how much the British government chooses to charge to that, it is engaged in direct or finance or not. So the standard method would be that the British government sells debt. Under pressure, what the Bank of England has repeatedly done is to buy that debt off the people who bought it from the British government. So the cash travels. The private investors give the British government money in exchange for the IOU, and then the Bank of England buys the IOU off the private investors, who then end up back with the cash, which they do on a huge scale, and that's just QE. So what they did last week was essentially to say, cut out the middleman. What we're basically just going to do is dispense with selling the IOUs to the public and allow the British government to run up, or the Treasury just simply said it was going to do it, going to run up an overdraft with the Bank of England. And it could be to the tune of several £10 billion, which is the maximum amount it reached in 2008, which is the last time they did this. And that then effectively is a claim by the Bank of England on the British government, which the British government receives cash. And if you like, it's the closest that we're going to come to directly printing money. It isn't really fundamentally different from the British government issuing the IOUs and then the Bank of England buying the IOUs. So why would the Bank of England change this? What it tells you is that very worrying things were happening in the market for IOUs. It became unattractive, shall we say, for the British government to be in the business of having to fund huge deficits by selling IOUs. In the long run, it might very well go back to doing that, and then it could use the money it raises by selling the IOUs to pay off the overdraft it now owes to the Bank of England. In the short run, it's just seemed convenient not to do it. Why? This takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, which is that we saw extremely disturbing things happening in the market for British government debt in the second and third week of March. The disturbing thing that we saw is that basically it wasn't obvious that there was an unlimited demand for British government debt. The British government doesn't feel comfortable unless every time it sells debt, there are 2 or 3 times as many people bidding for it as the amount of government debt that people issue. Why is there such a huge appetite? Well, because pension funds and insurers need very safe, very long-term investments, which will pay some interest over a long period of time. And that's what government debt's for them, for their purposes. And the fact that they were no longer in the market willing to take as much as the British government wanted to issue, or in fact selling debt they already held in ways which were abnormal, made people feel very, very anxious. And so using this direct financing route sidesteps that. It isn't a commitment in the long run to simply fund all government purchases out of the Ways and Means account, but it's a way for the interim, for the worst phase of this crisis, of avoiding, if it seems inconvenient, the gilt market.
I suppose Fox is saying we need to wrap up, and I just want to, I mean, so again, the debates that come out of sort of modern monetary theory, MMT, and so on. Why couldn't the government just say, well, you know what, we want to build X thousand new houses, we're going to spend £20 billion doing it, and rather than pursuing the sort of classical route of either increasing taxes or moving the budget from somewhere else, just do what's effectively happened here? Why is that not a long-term solution to remedying certain issues around public services, for instance?
We are in the space of MMT. We are in the space of functional finance. That is the world that we're in right now. That's absolutely the right diagnosis of where we're at. And you'll find people like Willem Boyter and Sonny Kapoor, really kind of mainstream analysts, all over the world saying right now, this is MMT world that we're in. That many of us find the politics of MMT and the affect almost of MMT, the quasi-religious quality of MMT, off-putting. And it is, after all, just part of a broad church of functional monetary thinking that goes back to the 1940s. But undeniably, we are in that space. And in the aftermath of this crisis, those are the questions that we need to engage with if there is going to be the scope for progressive politics, because otherwise those debts are going to be the cross that we're nailed on. That's
a brilliant place to finish it. Thank you so much, Adam. This has been a great show. For everybody watching, we're back tomorrow night, 8 p.m. I believe it's with Michael Walker. Adam's book, Crashed, is available in all good bookstores, also on ebook. Don't buy it from Amazon, preferably get it from a local bookstore if you can. You possibly have a lot of time to read. I feel kind of guilty saying I'll read this book during the lockdown because I've got friends who have children, and I can't imagine anything worse than being sort of incarcerated with 2 toddlers for 12 weeks. But anyway, Adam, thank you again. You've been brilliant. Everyone out there, we'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.
Pleasure. Thank you.